For nearly 20 years, Ethan Cole had lived a quiet, unremarkable life on the edge of Crestwood Valley, a picture-perfect suburban development where every lawn was trimmed to regulation height, every mailbox matched, and every neighbor wore the polite, plastic smile of HOA perfection. Ethan's property sat just beyond the ornate brick walls that enclosed the subdivision. It was a wide, overgrown stretch of land, 35 acres of rolling fields and wooded patches, inherited from his grandfather who had bought it long before Crestwood even existed. To most people, the land looked abandoned, the kind of place developers saw as wasted potential. But to Ethan, it was peace. He spent his days restoring old furniture in a barn his grandfather built, watching deer graze in the misty mornings, and enjoying the solitude. The land was paid for, the taxes were low, and he had no interest in selling it to anyone. That peace shattered the day the surveyor trucks rolled in. At first, Ethan thought they were lost. The men in hard hats and neon vests didn't say much, just measured, flagged, and left. A week later, heavy machinery arrived. Bulldozers began scraping away the topsoil, flattening what used to be wild meadows. The sound of grinding metal echoed through the valley. It wasn't long before Ethan realized they weren't on Crestwood's side of the fence anymore. They were on his. When he confronted the construction foreman, the man waved a clipboard and told him, flatly, that everything was permitted. The new phase of Crestwood, Crestwood East, had already been approved by the city. Roads were planned, lots were marked, and homes were being built. Ethan insisted they were trespassing. The foreman smirked, said something about public records, and got back into his truck. Ethan went home fuming. That night, under the flickering light of his workshop lamp, he dug through his grandfather's old filing cabinet, dust-covered boxes of deeds, surveys, and tax receipts. And there it was, a yellowed, brittle piece of paper stamped by the county recorder in 1971. The deed. It clearly stated the property lines. His land extended far beyond where Crestwood's new phase was being constructed, including nearly 100 of their planned lots. But when Ethan took it to the county office the next morning, the clerk told him something that chilled his blood. The new subdivision's documents had been approved based on a different set of plats, ones that seemed to exclude his land entirely. It was as if his property didn't exist. Someone had overwritten the boundaries, perhaps during rezoning or development planning. And no one had bothered to tell him. The clerk's expression turned sympathetic but distant, the kind that said, "You're right, but it's too late." Ethan was told to file a formal dispute with the developer and, if necessary, take it to court. But the paperwork could take months. In that time, Crestwood East would be finished, sold, and populated. Ethan spent the next weeks watching as construction spread like wildfire. Streets took shape. Model homes appeared. Families began touring the area with realtors, pointing excitedly at plots, his plots. The HOA posted bright new signs at the entrance, "Welcome to Crestwood East, luxury living for modern families." He tried contacting the developer, the city planning office, even the HOA board. He got nowhere. Every email went unanswered, every phone call redirected. The city's legal department insisted everything had gone through the proper channels. Ethan's claim, they said, would require verification. So he waited. And he watched. Each passing day felt like an invasion. Trucks churned through mud that had once been his walking trails. Cement poured into the soil his grandfather had planted with wildflowers. He saw the old oak tree, the one his family had picnicked under, bulldozed without hesitation. He felt helpless, like a ghost haunting his own property. Then one afternoon, a woman from the HOA stopped by. She was impeccably dressed, beige blazer, clipboard, sunglasses that reflected Ethan's scowl. She informed him that residents had complained about the appearance of his lot, the barn, the weeds, the lack of fencing. She spoke as if he were one of their homeowners, subject to their rules. Ethan didn't respond. He simply closed his gate in silence and watched her drive away. That night, under the fading orange glow of sunset, he made a decision. He wasn't going to stop the construction. He wasn't going to fight them with fences or protest signs. No, he was going to let them build everything. Every house, every driveway, every manicured lawn. Let them pour their money and labor into land that wasn't theirs. Then, when it was finished, he would take it all back. For months, Ethan lived like a shadow among the chaos. He watched foundations poured, families move in, and streetlights flicker to life. He said nothing, filed nothing, caused no trouble. But quietly, he began collecting every scrap of evidence: aerial maps, drone footage, dated photographs, soil reports, even the construction permits themselves. He archived everything with precision. The more he researched, the clearer it became that someone, likely the development company, had manipulated the land records. They had redrawn the lines, slipped it through the zoning office, and fast-tracked approval before anyone noticed. It was corporate theft wrapped in paperwork. By the time the last house was completed, nearly 96 homes stood on Ethan's land. Crestwood East was a thriving neighborhood. Children rode bikes on the same dirt paths Ethan had walked as a child. The HOA sent out glossy newsletters bragging about their beautiful expansion. Property values were soaring. Ethan waited for the perfect moment, and it came sooner than anyone expected. A letter arrived from the HOA, addressed to Mr. Ethan Cole, Lot 97. They claimed he was in violation of community guidelines for failing to maintain his property and threatened fines. They didn't even realize he wasn't part of their association. They truly believed his land, and everything on it, was theirs to govern. That was the spark he needed. Ethan gathered his evidence, hired a quiet but relentless attorney, and filed a property ownership claim in county court. It was a simple document, clean, factual, and devastatingly precise. He attached the original deed, the aerial maps, and the records showing the fraudulent survey lines. He named the HOA, the developer, and the construction company as defendants. When the summons reached the HOA board, panic erupted. They had no idea they were sitting on disputed land, or maybe they had, and hoped it would never come to light. Either way, the storm had begun. Ethan stood by his window the night before the first court hearing, looking out over the glittering lights of Crestwood East. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, unaware. 96 homes, each built on a foundation of lies. He almost felt sorry for the families, almost. Because when the truth came out, none of them would own a single square foot of the land beneath their feet. And Ethan Cole, the quiet man they ignored, would own it all again. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. Ethan Cole sat near the back of the courtroom on the first day of hearings, silent and watchful. His attorney, a calm man named Harris with silver-framed glasses, handled the introductions. Across the aisle, the representatives for Crestwood Development, the HOA board, and the construction firm shuffled nervously through their binders, whispering in hushed, urgent tones. None of them looked confident. The case was deceptively simple on paper. Ethan claimed rightful ownership of the land on which the entire Crestwood East subdivision stood. 96 homes. Streets, sidewalks, parks, all built on ground his deed said was his. The defendants, meanwhile, claimed they had acquired proper zoning and development rights from the county, relying on the most recent plats filed with the recorder's office. But as Harris began presenting the timeline, survey discrepancies, altered plats, missing documentation, forged signatures, the courtroom's mood shifted. Every piece of evidence connected with another, like puzzle pieces forming a clear picture. The development company had redrawn the boundaries years ago, quietly shifting them east to absorb Ethan's land into their expansion plan. Someone in the planning department had signed off, whether through corruption or incompetence. And the HOA, built on those falsified records, now stood on stolen ground. The HOA's attorney tried to argue good faith. He claimed that the residents had purchased their homes legally, unaware of any underlying issue. They were innocent bystanders, he said, and any claim against the HOA was punitive and unfair. But fairness was no longer the question. Ownership was. The judge, an older woman with steel-gray hair, listened intently. She asked few questions but scribbled notes constantly. Ethan watched her expression change when Harris produced the original 1971 deed, the one with the embossed county seal and his grandfather's signature. That paper had survived fires, storms, and decades of neglect. Yet its words were crystal clear. The property line extended beyond the creek, encompassing all of Crestwood East. It was a turning point. The courtroom fell into uneasy silence. The HOA president, a well-dressed man named Patterson, visibly paled. Over the following days, the paper war intensified. Both sides submitted mountains of documents. Old land surveys, tax records, utility permits. It was a bureaucratic battleground, where truth was buried in layers of filings, cross-referenced maps, and outdated databases. Ethan learned that the developers had acquired Crestwood's land through a series of holding companies. One of those entities had submitted a revised plat 10 years ago, but the attached map, as Harris demonstrated, didn't match the county's official archives. Someone had altered the coordinates by mere fractions of a degree, just enough to shift the line eastward and swallow Ethan's property. A clever fraud, invisible to anyone who didn't compare the maps side by side. The judge ordered an independent survey. A team of experts was sent to mark the true boundary, comparing physical landmarks with the legal descriptions in the oldest deed. When they returned, their report was concise and devastating. The majority of Crestwood East, 96 homes, a park, and 2 internal streets, stood squarely on land belonging to Ethan Cole. The revelation made headlines across the county. News crews arrived, setting up cameras outside the courthouse. Homeowners, terrified, began demanding answers from the HOA. Many had sunk their life savings into these homes. Some were still making mortgage payments. None of them knew that the soil beneath their driveways wasn't legally theirs. Ethan stayed quiet through the chaos. He didn't speak to reporters or neighbors. He spent his evenings walking the property line, now marked again by the survey team's bright orange stakes. It was surreal, seeing them planted in people's yards, tiny reminders of a truth buried for a decade. Behind the scenes, the HOA scrambled. They petitioned the court to dismiss the case on public interest grounds, arguing that upholding Ethan's claim would displace families and destabilize the community. They painted him as selfish, even vindictive, a man who wanted to tear down homes to reclaim land he'd never used. But Harris was ready. He filed a quiet yet devastating motion, a request for full recognition of Ethan's ownership, immediate injunction against further HOA interference, and compensation for unlawful use of property spanning more than 7 years. He attached the drone footage Ethan had taken, showing the entire development process, from the first bulldozer breaking ground to the final cul-de-sac paving. Every frame was dated, every image catalogued. It was irrefutable evidence that the HOA and developers had built, sold, and profited from land that wasn't theirs. As court sessions dragged on, the homeowners association fractured. Board members resigned. Angry residents stormed meetings, demanding explanations. The HOA newsletter stopped circulation. Rumors spread that the developer was trying to negotiate a massive settlement behind closed doors, one that would buy Ethan out quietly and avoid total disaster. But Ethan wasn't interested in money. He didn't want a payout, he wanted accountability. His land had been stolen, paved over, and turned into a product. He wanted that theft recognized, legally and publicly. Still, the reality was grim. If the court ruled in Ethan's favor, it wouldn't just mean compensation. It meant those 96 homes technically stood on private land they didn't own. The county would have to reevaluate property titles, mortgages, and taxes. Some residents might even lose their homes. The system had no clear process for a mistake of this scale. When the final round of arguments ended, the judge recessed for deliberation. The air in the courtroom felt thick, charged. Outside, news vans lined the streets. The HOA's attorney looked drained. Patterson, the president, stared at the table, motionless. Ethan simply waited, calm as he had for months. That night, he sat alone in his barn. The old wooden walls creaked softly in the wind. The property was quiet again, just like before the bulldozers came. He thought about his grandfather, who had worked this same land by hand, never imagining it would become the center of such a battle. In the morning, the court would deliver its ruling. He had waited years for justice. He could wait one more night. The next day, when the judge finally returned to the bench, the courtroom was packed to the brim. She began reading her decision slowly, carefully, outlining every document, every discrepancy, every lie uncovered in the plat revisions. And then came the words that changed everything. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Ethan Cole. The deeds and surveys confirm that the land currently occupied by Crestwood East lies within his legally owned property. Gasps filled the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Homeowners looked stunned, some visibly crying. The HOA's representatives sat in silence. The judge continued, declaring that all future governance, maintenance, and property activity on that land were subject to Ethan's consent. The court also ordered a full review of potential damages owed. Ethan didn't smile. He simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had finally surfaced. But the battle wasn't over. The legal victory was just the beginning, because now, the entire neighborhood had to face the consequences of what had been built on stolen soil. And as the cameras flashed and chaos erupted, Ethan stepped out of the courthouse and into the cool morning light, knowing one thing for certain: Crestwood East wasn't ready for what came next. The news spread like wildfire. By the evening after the court ruling, the story had reached national headlines. Man reclaims neighborhood built on his land, one outlet declared. Another called it the greatest HOA mistake in America. Within 24 hours, Crestwood East, once the pride of suburban order, became a symbol of arrogance, greed, and incompetence. At first, Ethan tried to ignore it. He didn't care about the attention, the cameras, or the chaos. But chaos has a way of finding its way home. The next morning, he woke to a line of cars parked along the main road that once cut through his fields. News vans, reporters, curious onlookers, even homeowners holding protest signs, "Justice for Crestwood families," and "We bought in good faith." They gathered at his gate, shouting questions, pleading for statements. Ethan didn't answer. He stayed inside, his curtains drawn. The land was his again, yes, but the victory felt hollow. He hadn't wanted to ruin lives, but the truth was, the HOA and developers had built a community on a lie, and now the people living in those homes were realizing it. Over the next week, letters began to arrive. The first came from the HOA's remaining board members, a desperate, panicked appeal to negotiate a resolution that preserves community stability. They offered to pay reasonable compensation for an easement, allowing the residents to stay without interruption. Their tone was suddenly polite, almost pleading. The second letter came from the developer's legal team. It was cold, technical, and dripping with arrogance. They proposed a buyout, a multi-million-dollar payment in exchange for Ethan signing away all future claims. They wanted silence, a quick end, and their reputation intact. Ethan tore that letter in half. Then came the residents. Handwritten notes slipped under his gate. Some begged for mercy. Some accused him of greed. One, from a single mother who had just moved into her first home, wrote simply, "Please, don't take my house. I didn't know." It hit him hard. Ethan wasn't cruel. He didn't want to see families evicted or homes demolished. But he also couldn't ignore what had happened. His grandfather's land, the very ground beneath those homes, had been stolen, parceled off, and sold for profit. They'd bulldozed his family's history, and the system had allowed it. As the days passed, the neighborhood descended into panic. Banks froze mortgages. Title companies sent notices declaring deeds under dispute. Homeowners couldn't sell, refinance, or even insure their properties properly. Their equity vanished overnight. Real estate agents pulled Crestwood East listings from the market. The HOA, once so proud and controlling, fractured completely. Patterson resigned, disappearing from public view. Residents argued in the streets. Meetings turned into shouting matches. People demanded to know how the board had never verified the land before building. Then came the city's involvement. Officials arrived for emergency meetings, trying to determine how to untangle the mess. The local government faced lawsuits from residents and developers alike. It became clear that the fraudulent plats had passed through more than one pair of approving hands. The city wanted the problem gone, and they wanted Ethan to make it easy for them. But Ethan didn't trust them. Not anymore. He met privately with Harris in the barn one evening, under the dim light of a single hanging bulb. The lawyer laid out the situation with the bluntness Ethan appreciated. He now legally owned every inch of Crestwood East. The court had confirmed it, and unless a higher court overturned the ruling, which was unlikely, no one could touch that land without his consent. Every homeowner, every street, every park technically existed under his authority. He could sell, lease, evict, fence it all off if he wanted to. The power was his. But Harris also warned him, the longer this dragged on, the uglier it would get. The residents would turn against him. The media would twist the story. Politicians would pressure him. And the developers? They would never stop trying to buy him out quietly, because the financial loss on their side was catastrophic. Ethan said nothing for a long time. He just stared out the barn window, watching the glow of the neighborhood's streetlights flicker in the distance. Those lights stood on soil his grandfather once plowed with his bare hands. The same soil they'd paved over without asking. He made his choice that night. The next morning, he filed a notice of land use suspension with the county. It was a single-page document, simple in wording but devastating in consequence. It declared that until further agreement was reached, all activity on his property, including the use, maintenance, and governance of structures, was to be temporarily halted. Legally, it meant no one could perform HOA duties, enforce community rules, or even use shared spaces like parks or roads without his permission. The development froze overnight. Mail delivery stopped. Trash collection paused. Utility companies hesitated to cross into a legal gray zone. The residents were furious. Protests erupted again, louder this time. People gathered at his gate, shouting his name, calling him a thief, a tyrant, a monster. Social media exploded with hashtags like #LandWar and #CrestwoodCrisis. But then, a quieter current began to form, residents who turned their anger elsewhere. They started asking questions about the developer, about the HOA's former board, about the city's approval process. They began to realize that Ethan wasn't the villain, he was the man exposing the truth they'd been shielded from. And when the first leaked emails appeared, correspondence showing that the developer had known about the boundary discrepancy years before construction, the tide turned completely. The story blew wide open. Investigations launched. The developer's CEO resigned. 2 city officials were placed on leave. Suddenly, everyone was apologizing, trying to distance themselves from the scandal. Ethan didn't celebrate. He didn't give interviews. He simply kept doing what he'd done from the beginning, watching, waiting, and keeping every record meticulously organized. Weeks turned into months. Crestwood East became a ghost town of uncertainty. Some families left, unable to live under the weight of legal limbo. Others stayed, clinging to the hope of resolution. Ethan's mailbox overflowed with offers, threats, and appeals. Some wanted to buy, others to beg. But he ignored them all. He wasn't ready yet. Because he knew something the rest of them didn't, this story wasn't over. Not even close. The courtroom ruling had exposed the theft, but it hadn't restored balance. There were still deals to unravel, responsibilities to assign, and restitution to claim. And deep down, Ethan had one final move, one that would bring everything full circle. A plan was forming, quietly, patiently. And when it was ready, the people who thought they could build an empire on his land were going to learn what it meant to lose everything they stole. By autumn, Crestwood East had turned from a suburban dream into a living monument of humiliation. The manicured lawns grew wild. The HOA office sat abandoned, its windows boarded up after an angry resident shattered the glass. News helicopters occasionally hovered overhead, filming the empty streets and half-deserted homes, a symbol of corporate greed, bureaucratic rot, and quiet vengeance. But for Ethan Cole, the storm had only begun to calm. Behind the scenes, his attorney Harris had been busy. The county's ruling had set off a domino effect in the legal world. Property lawyers, real estate firms, and even universities were dissecting the case, calling it a landmark in modern land restitution. Yet for Ethan, that meant nothing until the full weight of justice fell on those who had caused it. The court had given him ownership, yes, but Harris wanted more. He wanted to recover damages. Not just for Ethan, but for the years of illegal occupation, the profit the developer had made selling his soil, and the emotional toll of the theft itself. The next phase of the battle was financial, and far more brutal. When the first lawsuit hit the developer's corporate offices, it was like lighting a fuse. Ethan's claim wasn't a simple compensation demand. It was comprehensive, seeking repayment for every dollar made from land sales, every fee collected by the HOA, and every tax credit claimed on construction. The total exceeded $50 million. At first, the company tried to settle quietly. They sent representatives to Harris's office, carrying proposals thick as bricks. They offered money, houses, stock options, even partnership opportunities. But Ethan refused every offer. He didn't want their wealth. He wanted their admission of guilt. He wanted the truth written into the record that they had stolen his land, erased his history, and built their empire on a lie. When they realized he couldn't be bought, their tone changed. They started to fight back, publicly this time. They launched a campaign in the press, painting Ethan as a vindictive opportunist exploiting a clerical mistake. Paid spokespeople went on talk shows, claiming he was trying to destroy innocent families. Ethan ignored it all. He didn't give interviews, didn't argue, didn't speak. The silence unnerved them more than any statement ever could. Meanwhile, his legal team moved methodically. They subpoenaed records, bank transactions, city council communications, and internal developer memos. What they uncovered was staggering. The company had known about the discrepancy at least 5 years before construction began. An internal email chain revealed that their project director had flagged possible deed overlap but was told by executives to proceed as planned, "We'll resolve ownership later." That line, "We'll resolve ownership later," became the death sentence for the company. When it surfaced in court, the defense's composure shattered. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Investors pulled out. Stock prices plummeted. The corporate tower downtown, once adorned with banners showing happy suburban families, now stood as a monument to arrogance and greed. But Ethan wasn't done yet. The HOA came next. The same board that once fined residents for mailbox heights now faced its own reckoning. Harris filed an independent claim against the association for malicious trespass and unlawful governance. The lawsuit named every sitting member who had enforced HOA rules on land that wasn't theirs. The penalties were severe, enough to bankrupt the organization completely. Many of them resigned before the case even began. Others tried to blame the developer. Some even begged Ethan for forgiveness, pleading that they had only done what they were told. But he didn't respond. There was no satisfaction in their collapse, only a cold, quiet sense of closure. Through it all, Ethan stayed at his grandfather's old house on the edge of the property, watching the world unravel from a distance. The land was his again, not just legally, but spiritually. The air smelled the same as it did when he was a boy, sweet and heavy with pine and earth. But the land itself had changed. Paved streets cut through it like scars. Fences divided what was once open field. The homes stood like strangers, beautiful but hollow. They didn't belong there. They never had. In time, the homeowners began to accept the reality. The county had offered temporary occupancy licenses while ownership issues were sorted out. Some residents chose to buy back their lots directly from Ethan, at fair market value this time. Others simply walked away, their dreams left behind in half-furnished houses and overgrown driveways. Every sale, every negotiation, was a quiet act of restoration. Not revenge. Not profit. Just balance. But justice demanded one final act. One evening, Harris came to see Ethan with a proposal from the court, a public settlement conference. The developer's CEO would be required to attend in person. The purpose, to finalize damages and close the case. Ethan agreed. The conference took place in the same courthouse where it all began. The media waited outside, cameras flashing. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. On one side sat the remnants of the developer's legal team, tired, defeated, hollow-eyed. On the other, Ethan and Harris, calm and steady. The judge began the session by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the case. Then she turned to the developer's CEO, a tall man in a tailored suit who had spent months avoiding the public eye. He cleared his throat and read a prepared statement, admitting administrative oversights and expressing regret for the inconvenience caused. It was a hollow apology. A legal script, nothing more. Ethan sat silently through it all, then handed a small, leather-bound folder to the clerk. Inside were photographs, old, grainy images of his grandfather standing in those same fields decades ago, long before any development existed. Beneath them, a single page, the original deed. The judge examined it quietly. Then she looked at the CEO and said the words Ethan had been waiting for: "This document is the foundation of ownership." It was violated knowingly. You built your success on a man's legacy, and that legacy will be restored. The judgment was final. The company was ordered to pay full restitution and relinquish any remaining development rights in Crestwood East. The HOA was formally dissolved. All governance reverted to Ethan Cole, rightful owner. The courtroom erupted with flashes and whispers. The CEO sat motionless, his empire crumbling in real time. Harris placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder, but Ethan's eyes were fixed ahead, calm and distant. Outside, reporters shouted questions, but he didn't stop. He walked past them all, through the courthouse steps, into the cool wind of late afternoon. The sun was setting over Crestwood Valley, painting the sky gold. From where he stood, he could see the rooftops glinting in the light, 96 homes that had once stolen his past. Now, they were part of it again. But this wasn't victory. Not really. It was something deeper. It was the end of a cycle, greed repaid, truth restored, silence vindicated. And as the wind carried the faint echo of voices from the valley below, Ethan finally smiled, not out of pride, but out of peace. The reckoning was complete.